Hey guys, Ray Bashir's over Blue Shield Tactical Systems. Today I wanted to talk about something that it comes up quite often when it's use of force, what we like to call response to resistance with police officers, and some of the most controversial situations that we can think of, and there's obviously more, but we wanted to talk about some of those today. And one of those is shooting an unarmed person. Can a police officer be justified in shooting an unarmed person? And the answer is yes, they can. Just like a citizen could be justified in shooting an unarmed individual. And an example would be the Zimmerman case with Trayvon Martin. A jury found that Zimmerman was justified in using deadly force to shoot and kill Trayvon Martin. It would be no different, for a police officer. It is reviewed by a grand jury. In Texas, it reviews that case that's presented by the district attorney's office. They look at it, they get feedback from the district attorney because of course they're not attorneys, they're not lawyers, they're not use of force experts. In most cases, neither are those DAs, but they look at it and they say, okay, is this reasonable for a police officer or anyone in this type of situation to use deadly force to be able to stop the attack? And most of the time, that's what type of situation we're looking at, is an officer has been faced with an attacker who's gotten on top of them maybe and striking them, who has tried to get their gun out of the holster, pulled on their gun out of the holster. And that's one thing you always have to remember, guys, is there's always a weapon or weapons present when it's a police officer. They're going to have a firearm on their side. So if a suspect, a citizen, is trying to grab the gun and pull it out of the holster, once that officer makes distance, and in most circumstances, hopefully that happens, makes distance from this individual, they access their firearm and they point it at the person who is unarmed. Now, this person keeps advancing. The officer is justified in using deadly force in that circumstances. Now you can say, well, what if the officer was behind something where they couldn't get to him? Then that would be a completely different circumstance. And I'm not saying that it automatically fits within every possible outcome that we could think of. But what I'm telling you is the person who attacked the police officer, who was trying to pull the gun out of the holster, has already told the officer by his actions, his or her actions, that they're trying to take the firearm, they're trying to use deadly force against the officer. And also, guys, I want you to think about this as well. Law enforcement is enforcing laws. Citizens that are out there and get involved in a situation like this, of course, they may be a potential victim themselves of an attacker. It's somewhat different because there's a body cam generally now these days that's associated with the case. There's a lot of times cell phone footage. There's cameras, video footage that we see as well that comes up in those type of situations, or dash cam video. And we hang a lot of validity into the dash cam video or the cell phone video, which cell phone videos, guys, is a lot of those, some of those are edited as well. Surveillance video may be edited. The dash cam videos are not edited. The body cam videos are not edited unless the department is removing something from it that they don't want everyone else to know that is a piece of evidence, maybe. Then it may be edited. And a lot of times, if that is the case, or it's some type of the horrific moment during that encounter, they may remove that. And then they're going to tell you beforehand. They're going to tell you that this video has been edited, and here's the reason why. In those type of circumstances, the video is the video. It's not going to, the department doesn't have anything to hide there when they're putting that out there. So, can an officer shoot someone who's unarmed? Yes. Can a citizen shoot someone who's unarmed? The answer is yes as well. If they're able to justify deadly force and say that they did not have available alternatives based on the immediate necessity to use deadly force. And of course that can vary, and each case has to be looked at by a district attorney, by a grand jury, to be able to determine whether or not it was reasonable under Graham versus Connor, especially for law enforcement. And that kind of falls in as well for citizens, when they're looking at that cases. they're looking at, was it reasonable, the size of the offender, maybe the type of crime that was being committed. All those things kind of fall into place when it comes under Graham versus Connor. The other one that comes up is maybe the person had a gun to their side, or they stepped out with a gun in hand, but they haven't pointed the gun at the officer, and the officer uses deadly force. Guys, there's a reason why the person stepping out of a vehicle with a firearm in their hand. It's not to walk over to the officer and say, look in here, look at my new gun that I received. If an officer pulls up to a domestic and a person comes out onto, to the porch there and addresses officers and has a gun in his hand, and the officer's yelling at him to drop the gun and he's not dropping the gun, the officers don't need to wait to use deadly force against this individual. And the reason being is because we've done other videos on action versus reaction, and it actually shows that a person who has a gun to their side can raise and fire that firearm a lot of times before the officer can get that first shot off. No one wants to be placed in that situation. No one wants to be placed in a situation where they have to use deadly force. Officers don't want to be in that circumstance. And most officers are going to be able to go through their entire career without having to use deadly force. It's a very small percentage, believe it or not, even though the media would like for you to believe that there's a high percentage of officers that are involved in deadly force situations. And that is just not the case. And the reason they do that, guys, is because they have an agenda. And their agenda is they're a company, and they're selling viewership. So if they can create controversy amongst law enforcement or amongst us as citizens, then of course hopefully they're going to get more people to watch, right? The next one we're going to talk about is an officer shooting someone in the back. That's something that's brought up as well. Maybe you have an individual who has pointed a firearm at an officer, pulled the trigger, didn't go off, or it was unsafe. They turned and were shot in the back. Or maybe they've been attacking the officer, pulling on the officer's firearm. The officer is able to strike, maybe get distance from that individual, and then they drew their firearm. And as they're drawing the firearm to fire, and as they start to fire, the person turns to run, and they get shot in the back. Those are the kind of circumstances that I can think of right offhand. Now, of course, there could be others that come up where you would see someone that had gunshot wounds to their back, which doesn't mean that they were facing away from the officer, and at the time they may have been in the midst of that turn or away from the officer, and the officer shot him in the back. Now, also, let's say this is the circumstance where the person pointed a firearm again at the officer, or even shot at the officer, and they turn and they're running away from the officer. My opinion is deadly force is still justified. The reason why deadly force is still justified is because they didn't automatically stop becoming a threat to the officer or to society in general. You may have an individual that points a firearm at an officer, pulls a trigger, it's unsafe. So what do? They run over behind a tree, they take it off safe, or they get it back to where it should be, where it's working, and then they engage the officer again. So just because a firearm is not currently being pointed at the officer doesn't mean that deadly force is not justified. It is no different than, I'm sure many of us remember, because it wasn't that long ago, that the suspect in Dallas who shot and killed several police officers, 5, shot and killed them. And then he ran up into the building and had barricaded himself inside the building. Well, at the time, he wasn't shooting at anyone. He had already killed people, killed officers, and he wasn't shooting at anyone, but they ran a robot with a bomb strapped to it up to him and blew him up. It would be no different, guys, than if a person was shooting at law enforcement and wrecked out into a tree, let's say. And they had been actively trying to kill law enforcement, shooting at them or shooting at others, which places citizens in danger as well. If an officer then was shooting into the vehicle, even though the person's not actively shooting at them, would it still be justified? My opinion is yes, it would be, because the person has already shown that they are a danger to law enforcement and to the citizens that are out there. by their actions previously. Just like if someone had killed someone that you know of as a police officer, you know that they've killed someone, and they're putting their arm behind their back, and they've had a firearm in the previous thing where they've killed someone, and they stuck their arm behind their back, and you told them to bring it around the front, could it be justified? It really depends on the circumstance, but I would say yes, based on the previous history by the individual. It'd be no different than an officer that gets up to a domestic call, and this person's already assaulted several people, and the officer says, "You're on arrest," and they say, "Well, I'm not going to jail." And even though they're not actively attacking the officer at the time, could the officer use a taser or something else to be able to put them down? And that answer would be yes, because they've already shown the propensity for violence. Just like the person who's already shot and killed someone has shown the propensity to use homicide as a means. And the next one would be person with a knife or weapon. We get so hung up on a person having a knife, and we say, well, can't you use taser? Taser places that officer, especially if they're by themselves, in a situation to where they can get stabbed and killed because the taser doesn't make connection, or the person breaks the wires as he's still coming forward, and they are able to stab and stab the officer repeatedly and kill them. Officers don't sign up for that, guys. Officers don't sign up, even though I've heard some of that rhetoric from some people that are like members of Antifa and some of the other nut jobs that are out there. And I'm really glad to see that they labeled them as a domestic terrorist group, which is what they should be labeled. But if you have someone's coming at you with a knife, you shouldn't be trying to use a taser or something else. We just saw this in a video that was just released from Athens, Georgia, matter of fact. But an officer using deadly force against a deadly weapon is what they're trained to do. And it should be that way in that situation, because if they advance on the officer and get close enough, now to start stabbing a gun, we've talked about this before, is a distance weapon. And if I make connection up close to an officer and I'm stabbing, it eliminates his partner in most circumstances from being able to use their firearm to be able to stop the suspect. Also, the person is a threat to citizens as well, so the officer has to keep that in mind. Just because if he separates from the officers and runs into an area where there's a bunch of citizens, then he can end up hurting or stabbing or killing one of them. Anyone that is willing to attack a police officer, it's an attack on society itself. It really is. And we have to remember that these people that do this are criminals. Most of the time, well, all the time that I know of, where it's been a deadly force type situation, this person has already threatened people or already committed some type of criminal act that where law enforcement is responding to the scene. And it's amazing to me that the people that have their own agendas can, not look at these situations with an open mind to some degree and say, this person was violating the law, and then they displayed a weapon at the officer, and they ended up, the officer used deadly force to stop them. Guys, not every situation that we're talking about here is going to fit, like I said, within a certain box. Each situation has to be examined on its own. And we hang so much onto body cam footage, and we look at it and we say, well, this is the definitive answer. It's no different than I agree with the Dallas FOP, where they just came out and said that, an investigation completed in 8 days involving an officer-involved shooting is ridiculous. I agree with that statement. The reason being is because, it takes a lot longer to look over what type of video system was being used, the frames per second, distance, ballistics that are out. All those things come into play when we're talking about an officer-involved shooting. And, when we look at a video, it's not the definitive answer. It's a piece of evidence. That's all it is a piece of evidence. The officer's statement, the witness statements, things like that. And, we know that witness statements are not always accurate, unfortunately. Now, can we combine that, those statements with the video footage that may be available? Sure. But it is difficult for us to be able to tell distance a lot of times from these videos, even the dash cam videos, body cam videos. We assume also that the officer is looking the same direction that the body cam is, and that's just may not be the case as well. They may not see what the body cam is seeing or the dash cam is seeing. So it is the perception of that officer at the time that is faced in that situation who has to make that split-second decision based on what they feel is their life being put in danger. It would be we've seen the cases also, guys, where someone has had a cell phone in their hand, and it may be at nighttime or whatever it may be, and they raised up the cell phone, and the officer said, drop the gun, and he ended up shooting and killing the person whom they thought had a gun in their hand. Based on what? Based on what they were seeing, based on maybe the movement, the stance. I mean, there's a lot of factors that come into play there. If they don't make the right decision, it can end up costing them their lives. So we have to remember those things when we're reviewing and we're looking at these videos. There's a lot more to it than just the video itself. So I think also departments could do a much better job in educating their community in use of force. The reason being is putting them in scenarios. The Citizens Police Academy is a great outlet for that. And a lot of those people in the community can end up being on a jury. So it's important for them to have some type of knowledge beforehand, some type of education in use of force. And what the Supreme Court has already ruled as well on what is reasonable for an officer to do. So guys, I hope that this video maybe gives you a little bit of insight. It's just a few of the circumstances that we see, that come up. Some of them are, like I said, are controversial. So I want to make sure that you guys are getting some type of information. So log on to blueshieldtactical.com, guys, for any other videos that we have that are maybe coming up. Also our courses. We do have some civilian courses as well that you may be interested in attending. So there's some good things that are out there. So guys, be safe out there and watch your six. Thanks.